Muslims today are looking for heroes. They're looking at comic books. They're looking at Western presidents and prime ministers and kings to be their heroes. What happened to our real heroes? The German king William II said, "I've met many monarchs and rulers in my life, and I found them all to be my inferiors, or at best my equals. But when I entered the presence of Abdul Hamid, I began to tremble." He is such a hero, the most important hero in the last 100 years that we must remember, who stood up against the whole world for 33 years alone, defending the rights of every Muslim from east to west to north and south.
Cherkess people were really fascinating. They come into the Ottoman domains and quickly become part of the Ottoman administration. And Sultan Abdul Hamid's mother was Cherkess. She died when he was 11, and then his stepmother, who couldn't have children, was also Cherkess, and she took good care of him and gave him most of his education. And it's an interesting story. When Abdul Hamid was young, he wasn't a religious kid, he was an older kid. He became religious as he got older.
السلطان عبد الحميد له صفات، من صفات الهدوء التام، وكان قد ورثه عن زوج أبيه. فأبوه بعد وفاة أمه تزوج امرأة. هذه المرأة توفيت أم السلطان عبد الحميد وعمره 11 سنة، فرعته زوج أبيه رعاية بالغة وحنت عليه، فأحبها حبا جما، حتى أنه عندما تولى السلطنة سماها بالسلطانة. لم يجعل زوجه هي السلطانة كما جرت العادة، جعل زوج أمه هي السلطانة، لكنه قال لها بكل حزم، قال لها: يا أماه، أنت الآن السلطانة، لكن لا أسمح لك أبدا بحزم وبقوة بتدخلي في شؤون القصر بأي حال من الأحوال.
So 1876 is the year of the 3 sultans. What this means is that Sultan Abdulaziz, who was the uncle of Sultan Abdul Hamid, was deposed. He was removed from power. And the reason why he was removed from power is because they wanted a constitutional caliphate. There's a unique idea of having a Khilafah system which is constitutional. And he wanted a parliament. Well, they wanted a parliament, right? And so what they did is initially they removed Abdulaziz from power and they brought Murad in power to be the constitutional caliph. Legend has it that Abdulaziz killed himself after being deposed, but it's very unlikely he did that. And the reason being is because both his wrists were slit. So the chances are that he was probably murdered, because he was resisting the idea of having a constitutional caliphate, because he wanted to be the absolute sultan. That's where the challenge was. How do we have a system where we could remove the caliph from power? And so what they wanted was a document, a constitution of explaining to society what the role and job of the Khalifa was in relation to society and in relation to the Sharia. That's what they were trying to institutionalize. To have a constitution, the constitutional caliphate underneath, and then the Khalifa is important. Now, this became very controversial because people said in the Quran, it says, obey Allah and obey the messenger and those in authority from amongst you. How can you get a caliph and put him under a constitution? How is that even possible? So that's the system they wanted. They got it. And then they have a situation because they say society is not ready for it. People are not ready for it. The opinion of the public mattered for the first time. It did matter in the past, but they had people, representatives for them that were sufficient to safeguard their interest. Now, with newspapers and so forth, there's a closer bond between those who are governing and those who are being governed. But in fact, what you're seeing is, the zeitgeist at the time is everything is changing very quickly. The world is getting smaller and they're trying to centralize. Abdulaziz is dead, Murad comes into power, and then what happens is Murad goes crazy, loses his mind. And so then they choose Abdul Hamid II. The academics at the time said that Abdul Hamid was anti-constitution. That's not necessarily true. When we look at the information, Abdul Hamid didn't actually have a problem with the constitution. He just felt that people were not ready. And so there was a difference in opinion. One of the biggest problems they had was the role of non-Muslims in the Ottoman parliament. Can we have non-Muslims in the Ottoman parliament or not? The parliament became like a council, and should non-Muslims have the same weight of opinion as Muslims? It became a contentious issue at this moment. Some ulama said no, non-Muslims cannot be in the Ottoman parliament, and other ulama said they can be. It's not a problem. Some ulama went as far as saying that non-Muslims could be Grand Vizier, but we won't let that happen because it's a Muslim entity. Now that might sound outrageous to some people, but understand how the domains is. It's a multi-ethnic domains. Bosnia to Cairo to Yemen to Anatolia. It's huge. And there are many non-Muslims. And the argument that was made is that we should hear the opinions of non-Muslims regarding their communities, and we should hear the opinions of non-Muslims regarding what opinions and ideas they can give, because they are also loyal to where they live. But the Khalifa had to be Muslim, obviously. Sheikh al-Islam had to be Muslim. And the commander of the army had to be Muslim. The Grand Vizier could have been non-Muslim, but they said, we're not going to let that happen. So they opened the parliament, they go to war with Russia, and Abdul Hamid says, this parliament created chaos. It did nothing but create chaos for me. I couldn't make decisions. And what you see is now two decision-making processes. The first decision-making process, the idea is that one strong leader, the buck stops with that person, and they make all the decisions. The second idea is to have a parliament, and there's more decision makers in the parliament. Which system works? The ulama came to the conclusion both of them are possible. So now you start to see a shift taking place in history, backwards and forwards in terms of what type of political system they want. 78, Abdul Hamid says, goodbye, I'm out, I'm done with this. And so the constitutional experiment, it's gone. Now, what Abdul Hamid focused on when he came into power then is what they call in the West pan-Islamism, which actually the word we use is 𝗔𝙞𝙀𝙁. A better translation, if we were going to use a translation, is Islamic unity or Muslim unity. But pan-Islamism became a loaded term, political Islam. And Abdul Hamid is using pan-Islamic policies. So ittihad, unity, is what Abdul Hamid called for. And so his policy is now focused on a physical manifestation of Islam that can be seen within the Ottoman domains. Abdul Hamid had an interesting problem because he lost a lot of the Balkans, and so the only thing that was left was Turkey and the Arab provinces. What he did is he had this situation of ummah. How does the ummah work? You have ummah in the domains, you have ummah outside of the domains, and you have ummah that have lands that have just been lost. What do I do now? So what you see in this period is even the idea of ummah starts to become complicated in the minds of the Ottomans. Does Abdul Hamid as a caliph have any jurisdiction, any authority over Muslims outside of the domains? Can he help Muslims outside the domains? And what should his help be? The interesting question is what is the requirements for Muslims outside? So Muslims in India, what can they ask for? What can they ask for from the caliph who they don't live under? Can they say, give us A, B, C, D? And if he doesn't give it, is he a bad caliph? So Muslims in India were colonized by the British. They wanted Abdul Hamid to send an army to take them out. He says, I can't do that. My army's first lot strong enough, the domains is really big, and I have to get through Iran. How's this going to work? But I can send you money. Now here, what happens is Muslims today they start using today's morality to judge that past. That was unacceptable. Why couldn't he do that? But here's the complexity. The domains are moving, and he has to make a sense of what it means.
كان أيضا ومن العجائب أنه في الصين قد افتتح معهدا يسمى المعهد الإسلامي الحميدي نسبة إليه في الصين. ولما افتتح ذلك المعهد وجاء الصينيون ليحتفلوا بكوا لأنهم كانوا يجتمعون في قلوبهم مع السلطان العثماني والخليفة العثماني. كان خليفة عاما للمسلمين، وكانت قلوب المسلمين معه تحبه وتؤيده وتشد من أزره. إذن الجامعة الإسلامية كانت هاجسا كبيرا عنده، وكان يرسل المشايخ الإسلام وعلماء المسلمين إلى الأكراد ليهدئهم ويسكن من ثائرتهم باسم الإسلام. وكان يعمل شيء نفسه في ولايات الدولة العثمانية العربية وغير العربية، وكان يقرب إليه مشايخ وعلماء من الدول العربية وغيرها. كل ذلك يريد ما يسمى بالجامعة الإسلامية. وكان يقول إن القوة الحقيقية للدولة العثمانية تكمن في الجامعة الإسلامية، وأنه بالإسلام يجتمع المسلمون وسيكونون يوما ما قوة تضرب رقاب الكفار وتطردهم من بلادها. يعني كان دائما يحلم بهذه الجامعة الإسلامية في وقت كانت القوميات قد انتشرت في الدولة العثمانية انتشارا في الحقيقة انتشارا هائلا جدا.
Internally, the first thing he does is new educational policies. Abdul Hamid felt that the madrasa was not sufficient to give an education to Muslims who wanted to study other subjects apart from uluumuddin. Whereas in the past, the madrasa was sufficient to teach you math, science, and so forth. By the 19th century, engineering, translation, these sort of subjects became very difficult for the madrasa to deal with. The madrasa is also going through a flux. So you have one policy: build new schools. Reform the madrasa, or keep the madrasa and build new schools next to it. He couldn't trash the madrasa, obviously. He was never going to do that. He couldn't reform the madrasa, because if he reformed the madrasa, many conservative ulama were saying, what are you doing? Don't touch it. It's got nothing to do with you. The state was not paying for the madrasas. It was paid by society, communities, and so forth. Because the argument is that the madrasa should always be independent from power. Because if it's not, power can manipulate the madrasa. People keep asking the question, well, why didn't the Ottomans tax people to raise the money? Why did they take loans from the West? The reason why they couldn't tax people, because the ulama said you can't tax people like that. It's unfair. So where are they getting the money from? They can't tax people because people will complain that we're Muslim or non-Muslims, and why are you taxing us so high? What are you taxing us on? Where are you getting the money from? The zakat was not sufficient, and so now they're in a bit of a bind. We need to reform our military. We need to do that, but how do we do that?
كان السلطان عبد الحميد قد تولى وتركة الدولة ثقيلة إلى الغاية، وورث هذه المسألة، ورث ديونا هائلة تقدر ب 52 و200 مليون ليرة عثمانية ذهبا، وهي اليوم تقدر بمئات البلايين من الجنيهات الاسترلينية، مبلغ ضخم جدا من الديون. استطاع عبد الحميد بدهائه وذكائه وعدم إسرافه، وكانت صفة واضحة فيه، استطاع أن يخفض هذه الديون إلى العشر تقريبا، لتكون 30 مليون ليرة ذهبية عثمانية عندما قام الانقلاب عليه بعد أكثر من 30 سنة.
Understand that when the West were creating their new technological tools, they were doing it with the help of colonialism. They go places, take stuff, make money, build. But the Ottomans couldn't do that. So when the British built trains, they didn't build trains because they wanted to move people so they could have a wonderful journey in India. They were moving soldiers, they were moving resources. That was their mindset. That's why we will build trains, move it faster. When you're building new weapons, the reason why you're building weapons is to take out people quicker. So they started building new weapons. The Ottomans didn't have that mindset because that's not how they saw the world. The main crux in the Ottoman Empire at the time was the idea of justice. They weren't thinking of colonizing people. They were thinking of justice. How do you compete now with empires that are colonizing and using extreme violence? How do you adjust your policies? So the policy is, okay, we can take this from the West, but what do we do to it? Can we Islamize it? What type of education can we give the young Muslim community or societies, to the one hand, that can compete with the West, but at the same time not attack our Islamic educational system? Abdul Hamid's main idea was to give you a basic education and insist on morality, ethics and morality. Make sure all the Muslim students have good morals and values. Loyal to Islam, loyal to the Sultan, loyal to your teacher, and then loyal to your parents. And we can see in the 19th century, it mattered to the Ottomans. So Abdul Hamid's idea was education. The Hijaz railway station is the project that Abdul Hamid believes in, which is the project for the pilgrims, which is to have a railway station that starts in Istanbul and goes all the way down to Makkah and Medina and actually stretch to Sana'a in Yemen. And the idea is fundamentally for the pilgrims. That's the idea. So it's very different from what the British are doing in India. They're building infrastructure to be able to allow pilgrims to move up and down, because trains, steamships, telegram, and newspaper, these were new forms of technology that were allowing access of information and movement to happen a lot faster. Abdul Hamid unfortunately didn't get to see the actual Hijaz railway station take off in that sense, because the revolution happens and so forth. But it's a project he invested in heavily. The Germans did it because, once again, they had the tech and the machinery to do it, and they built the railway station And they had trains already in other parts of the Ottoman domains. So they had a railway that was going to Baghdad, and they built a railway that goes into the Balkans. So this is not the only train service that they're providing, but it is fundamentally for the pilgrims. And in World War I, it's used to be able to move the soldiers from up to down. And so Lawrence recognizes this, and he blows up the railway station to make sure it doesn't happen. It's a shame, because now people are imagining the possibility of having a railway from Istanbul to the Arab world again.
And he worked to wake up the spirit of Islam again. He was sending aid and help to the Muslims in Africa, in India, in Indonesia, everywhere to wake them up and bring the body of the Muslims together. He even started to spread Islam into Japan. The Emperor Meiji sent a letter to Sultan Abdul Hamid Han saying, "I'm asking you to send us scholars to teach us Islam, which can build a moral relationship between you and us." He was sending help to the Christians where their own kings and their own queens were forsaking them. He built the Hijazi railway to connect the whole Muslim world to Mecca and Medina. He reduced the debts of the empire by more than 90%. He kept Quds Sharif in the hands of the Muslims. He was the Khalifa in maybe the hardest times that the Ummah had ever seen. He was writing poems asking for help from Allah, saying, "My Allah, I know you are the Aziz. There is no Aziz but you. You are the one, nothing else. My Allah, take my hand in these hard times. My Allah, be my helper in this dangerous hour." He was a man that when the people of the East and the West saw him, their heads bowed down in respect. He inspired fear in the enemies of Islam with his 𝗾𝙂. In France, they wrote a play to insult the Holy Prophet ﷺ. When this was informed to Sultan Abdul Hamid Han, he told the French, "If you put on this play, I will declare war on you from the seat of the Khilafat on behalf of the entire Alam al-Islam." The Prime Minister of France himself stepped in and stopped the play from being performed.
Fezes were really interesting because one of the things you see in the Ottoman period is what we call clothing reform. Clothing in that time was a type of uniform. In the Ottoman context in the 19th century globally, uniform was a marker of identity. When the Turkish Republic was formed and people were making the ulama take off their hats and so forth, it became really problematic because one of the ulama said, first you take off our clothes, then you take off what's in our minds. You can't see a single photo in this period of a man without a hat. Everybody's got their head covered. When they tried to change the turban to the fez, it was also controversial. But they justified it by saying this came from Morocco. So in Turkey, they call Morocco fez. Okay, so it came from there. They said, we can deal with this. It's okay. This is Islamic. But in World War I, the fez became problematic because the Western soldiers could see these red hats and just pop them off. So you can see clothing, how it works and operates in that sense as well. So there's a to and fro to everything. In this period, the Muslims were really concerned about women's clothing, actually. And there was a piece by Mehmet Akif, who wrote the Turkish national anthem, and he's talking about Islamic civilization, Madaniyah. And this random paragraph comes in about women's clothing. And they were complaining that, it was really fascinating, that the women are showing their wrists. So they were annoyed that the women were showing their wrists, actually, in this context. They just felt that more and more women were starting to become a lot more flagrant in their clothing choices. When Abdul Hamid did the education, there was education for women too.
وكان يقاوم التفسخ الغربي الوارد إلى بلاده حتى أنه عندما بدأ يلاحظ وهو سلطان بدأ يلاحظ أن بعض النساء تخلينا عن اللباس العثماني وصرنا يلبسنا اللباس الأوروبي. تخلينا عن اللبس العثماني الجميل التي تغطي فيه المرأة وجهها اليشمك هذا المشهور العثماني. فأصدر مرسوما إلى الحكومة ليعلقوه في الشوارع وينشروه في الصحف أنه ليس لامرأة أن تسير في الطريق بدون أن تغطي وجهها بالنقاب العثماني المعروف، وعلى النقاب ألا يكون شفافا يبرز الوجه، بل عليه أن على المرأة أن تلبس نقابا يخفي محاسن وجهها ويكون كما هو الحال في اللباس العثماني المشهور. وجعلوا أمرا إلى الحكومة وإلى الشرطة.
When photographs came into the Muslim world at this time, they created what you would call memories for you. Photographs are really powerful. It was really intriguing how in the Ottoman domains now they were using photographs to construct the memory for you. This is what Quds looks like. This is what Baghdad looks like. This is what India looks like. Abdul Hamid was very interesting in the way he used photographs. Photographs of himself, removed it. He didn't want people to worship him. What he did is he put this up. But this symbol became far more powerful than a photograph in itself. It's a very unique way of creating an imagination of people. People never saw you, but they saw your signature stamped in the wall. You walk down the street of Damascus, there's a fountain, stamp. And so you had an image of the Sultan, but you didn't see the Sultan. It's very unique what he did. He tried to control the symbols that represent him. One of the unique things about Abdul Hamid, he understood symbolism. They have a saying in Turkey, which is 𝗃𝙤𝙨𝙩𝙤𝙤, meaning the state is working, because you can always see something is being built. So you can't see the Sultan, but you can see a hospital is built. Yes, the Dawla is working. There's a mosque here. Yes, they're working. That's sufficient for us. And Abdul Hamid was good at that.
There were those who were sitting next to him, and they were pretending to be his advisors, but they were against him. And they were plotting against him. But he had the intelligence of a believer, and he was looking with the nur of Allah, and he saw through their plots.
1909, we have a revolution. When the revolution happened, a lot of people argued that this revolution was inspired by the French Revolution. And so westernization is happening again. These people were students from these civil schools. So the very people that Abdul Hamid educated are the people that did a revolution against him. Why? It wasn't that Abdul Hamid was a bad sultan. Abdul Hamid was in power for 33 years. People got exhausted. This is a young generation that are seeing that while Abdul Hamid had maintained the Ottoman domains really well, but what was happening was they felt it was remaining static. It wasn't going beyond that. It wasn't moving. Mustafa Sabri said something really unique. He said when the revolution in 1908 happened, he said a revolution is what happens from the people. When the Turkish Republic revolution happened, he says you can't call that a revolution because that happened from the state. And when revolutions happened, it was really unique because they used the word inqilab. Now, when people heard this, they said, what does inqilab mean? Inqilab was a word invented by the Ottomans themselves. Prior to that, you don't see it much in Arabic literature. The word they used was thawra. What's unique about here, what you see in the Ottoman period, is that revolutions are the extreme form of negotiation with the government itself. There's people who are not being heard, they go to the street. And the ulama justified it. And they justified it against a Khalifa. Mustafa Sabri was one of them. It's interesting because they're afraid to give Abdul Hamid the fatwa. So the Muslims actually don't go to Abdul Hamid to give the fatwa. It's a couple of non-Muslims who turn up and say, you're out. And Abdul Hamid goes, what are you talking about? He says, here's a fatwa, time for you to go. Abdul Hamid capitulated. He didn't use violence on them. He didn't use aggression on them. He said, fine.
He checked and he said, how many people? What's the percentage that is uprising? So Sultan Abdul Hamid Khan looked and he checked. He checked those nations that were under his ruling and he saw that they were uprising. Against what? They said, we want to be free. He saw that these are the nations, this is how much percentage there are in each nation uprising. And Sultan Abdul Hamid Khan sat and he waited. He said to his people, don't do anything. The general said to him, O Sultan, we have a big power, we have a big army, we can crush them down. He said, no, all these soldiers who are with me, if one dies in this way, then I will be very sorry in the judgment day. They didn't use the army. He let them uprise. They took him, they sent him to exile. If he had wanted, he could have captured those people coming to him, but he knew. So he didn't object. He said, okay, if people don't want me, I leave. I leave it to the people. They captured Sultan Abdul Hamid, who was such a sultan that he is a symbol of justice. They made him get on a train in Istanbul. They took him to Salonika to insult him. When he got off the train, the cursed ones there came and called him Corporal Hamid. The Sultan took out his handkerchief and he ripped it apart and said, may Allah make you like this.
This is an interesting picture because this is a picture that shows that this was a delegation that tried to remove Sultan Abdul Hamid from power. Actually, this photograph is a fake. There's Abdul Hamid with his hands in his pocket like this. Abdul Hamid never put his hands in his pocket. Never put his hands in his pocket. So these images, these photographs, these paintings were constructing an idea in the minds of people of what we did and how we removed the Sultan. There are enough information that Abdul Hamid was worried because he was concerned that he would be killed. Because one of the problems they had is if a sultan still remained in existence and there was another sultan, there would be an army that could be supportive of him that could come back. But here, Abdul Hamid wasn't killed, actually. They sent him to Salonika instead, out of Istanbul, so that he couldn't gather an army to start off what they would call a counter-revolution. And Abdul Hamid was really concerned about World War I. When they asked him about how could we have got out of World War I, he said, firstly, we should never have got involved in World War I. But he said, if we were to get involved in World War I, you should have stayed on the side of the British never lose. When he passes away, it's really fascinating. The people that deposed him from power felt so guilty that they were part of the procession. Some of them even held his coffin.
يقول أنور باشا وهو أحد كبار القواد العثمانيين، يقول لجمال باشا السفاح المشهور في دمشق: لقد كنا أغبياء يا جمال حينما قمنا بالثورة على السلطان، لقد كنا ألعوبة في أيدي الصهيونية العالمية. هذا اعتراف ضخم من أنور باشا لجمال باشا. والسلطان عبد الحميد في الحقيقة مدحه أناس كثيرون جدا من ساسة أوروبا، مثال السياسي الألماني الداهية بسمارك، ومثال رئيس الوزراء البريطاني المشهور ذي الأصل اليهودي دزرائيلي، ومثال عدد كبير جدا من المؤرخين والساسة الغربيين والشرقيين على السواء، وعدد كبير من العرب ومن العثمانيين مدحوه مدحا بالغا، خاصة عندما تبينت لهم الحقائق بعد ذلك. أن هنالك رجلا اسمه رضا توفيق كان شاعرا وكان اتحاديا كما سيأتي تفسير اتحادية، وكان ماسونيا من كبار الماسونيين، وهو ممن سعى طويلا في عزل السلطان عبد الحميد. هذا رضا توفيق كان شاعرا. لما توفي عبد الحميد ماذا قال بعد أن وجد ما وجد من انهزام الدولة وتفتيتها وتقطيع أوصالها؟ قال: عندما يذكرك التاريخ يا أيها السلطان يكون الحق دائما ومعا، دائما في جانبك ومعك أيها السلطان العظيم.
Neredesin şevketlim Sultan Abdülhamid Han? Feryadım var mı badıgahına? Ölüm uykusundan bilahsa uyan, şundan kör milletin bak günahına. Tarihler ismini andığı zaman sana hak verecek ey koca sultan. Bizdik utanmadan iftira atan asrın en siyasi padişahına. Padişah hem zalim hem deli dedik, ihtilale kıyam etmeli dedik. Şeytan ne dediyse biz deli dedik, çalıştık fitnenin intibahına. Divane sen değil meğer bizmişiz, bir çürük ipliğe hülya dizmişiz. Sadece deli değil edepsizmişiz, tükürdük atalar kıblegahına.
Today Muslims, all Muslims, they forget their history. They forget the history of Islam. They forget the history of faith. They're not interested in the history of Islam. They're interested in the history of their own nationalities. But when it comes to Islamic history, they take nothing from it. Because in reality, the Muslims were made to forget their history. Because the pages of history now are filled with the betrayal and tyranny of those who want to hide it. But Muslims must know their history. If they want to take a single step forward, Muslims must know where they fell down. The British came to Sharif Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, the governor of the Haramain, and said, "Why are you being ruled by these Turks? Why don't you separate? We will make you into a new Khalifa. Fight against these Ottomans." And so the Arabs rebelled against the Sultan. What was the intention of the British? To help the Arabs? It is to weaken the Ottomans. It was to weaken the Sultan. It was to crush Islam. It was to continue the Crusades. The Arabs became the pawns in somebody else's chess game. While the Arabs were fighting and betraying the Ottomans, the British, the French, the Russians, and the Italians, they were dividing up the Arab lands. That rebellion made the hadith of the Holy Prophet ﷺ come true when he said, soon a time will come when the nations will gather against you, just as people gather around a feast. Someone asked, will it be because we are small in number, Ya Rasulullah? He said, no, you will be in huge numbers, but you will be as useless as the scum on the sea. And Allah will remove the fear that your enemies used to have for you from their hearts, and He will place al-wahn in your hearts. They asked, what is al-wahn? Rasulullah ﷺ said, love of the dunya and hatred of death. They said to the Arabs, how come you are living under the ruling of a man who is not from amongst you? They listened until they became divided. And the Arabs, they stabbed the Khalifa in the back, letting the British and the French march into the lands of Islam. The armies of the Sultan were forced out of Damascus from Quds, while the Arabs welcomed the Crusaders with open arms. But as the cities fell one by one, there was one city that did not fall. There is one city where the Ottoman soldiers held on with their last drop of blood. Madinatul Munawwara, the city of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. The Arab rebels made 130 attacks on the city of the Prophet. On one day, on just one day, the Arab rebels and their allies, they fired more than 300 bombs on the city of the Prophet. The Arab rebels and the British with Lawrence destroyed the Hijaz railway, cutting off the food and supplies of the Ottomans. One of the soldiers said, our food was cut off, so Allah sent us provisions from the sky. What was he talking about? Grasshoppers, locusts started to fall into Medina, and 𝗲𝙗 Pasha told his soldiers, take these insects, cook them and eat them, or else you're going to die from starvation. And we have to live to protect the Prophet. Those Turks, those Ottoman Turks, those defenders of Medina, they starved. Even after the Ottoman Empire was forced to surrender in the war, 𝗲𝙗 Pasha refused to leave Medina. He stood up and said, I will never abandon you, Ya Rasulullah. And one day, he stood on the minbar of Masjid al-Nabawi and he addressed the soldiers and said, O soldiers, I call out to you, I order you to defend him and his city to the last bullet and the last breath, regardless of the strength of the enemy. May Allah help us, and may the prayers of Muhammad ﷺ be with us. O soldiers of the heroic Turkish army, O Mehmetçiks, O little Muhammads, come forward and swear to me to honor your faith with the supreme sacrifice of your lives. And Sharif Hussein, who was honored by the Khalifa, Sharif Hussein, who betrayed Islam, sent a message to 𝗲𝙗 Pasha, ordering him to surrender. 𝗲𝙗 Pasha wrote a letter to Sharif Hussein, addressing him, saying, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, to the one who broke the power of Islam, caused bloodshed against the Muslims, put in danger the Khilafat and the Amir al-Mu'minin, and exposed Islam to the dominations of the British. On Thursday night, the 14th of Dhul-Hijjah, I was walking, tired and exhausted from thinking about the defense of Medina, when I found myself among unknown men working in a small area. Then I saw in front of me a man with the most beautiful face. It was Rasulullah ﷺ. His left arm was resting on his hip under his robe, and he said to me in a protecting voice, "Follow me." I followed him 2 or 3 steps and woke up. I'm now under the protection of Rasulullah ﷺ. He is my supreme commander. I'm busying myself and strengthening the defenses, building roads and squares in Medina. Do not trouble me with your useless offers. Fahruddin Pasha kept his promise. He did not surrender Medina. In the end, some of his desperate men, they arrested him and took him by force out of the city. And the Arab rebels entered the city. For 12 days, they pillaged Medina. They stole, they desecrated, they disrespected, they destroyed. They broke the locks of more than 4,000 homes, and they looted everything. And Sharif Hussein and his children, they were betrayed.